Good evening, everybody. Shock. Everybody's awake now. Welcome to the 4th annual David Buchan lecture. Before we begin, I wanted to tell you not so much where the exits are and how to fasten your seatbelts, but rather a little bit about the Elphinston Institute, who is hosting this event, before we begin. So, the Institute was founded in 1995 to build a bridge between the university and its community by researching and promoting and celebrating the culture of the northeast of Scotland. We study culture and context, and we do this through ethnology and folklore, which are diverse and interesting disciplines at the crossroads of history, culture, psychology, and we look at how people make sense of the world around them through the cultural lens of individual experience, families, and community, and how they create significance in the world around them. As ethnologists and folklorists, we are interested in the individual experience that gives meaning to individual lives rather than the broad sweeps of social history. Not so much the grand movements of politics for us, but rather, as my predecessor Ian Russell puts it, the value of individual narratives that give these larger issues perspective and an anchor in the reality of everyday life. These first-hand narratives are the experienced truth of the kind often not found in the scanty records of the past, and they can contain emotional truths, as David Buchan himself wrote, not so much what happened as what people felt about it and what they thought about it. Ethnology and folklore explore life as it is lived by individuals rather than through facts and figures or theories. Broadly speaking, our research falls under 3 themes: creativity, community, social resilience; language and the expressive arts, music, song, and story of the Northeast here; and knowing by doing. That is, the knowledge that people acquire by doing things, learning them by watching other people do them, or taking an object and figuring out how it's made, as my mother did when she made a kilt for me 30 years ago. She took somebody else's kilt while it was off the person and had a look at how it was made and figured out how to make it, applying her knowledge to a new object and transforming it into something else. And we do all this work through field work, by sitting down with people and recording interviews with them, talking to them about their experience, about their lives, and how, as I said, they make sense of the world around them. We also do a lot of public engagement. We have a teaching program, a master's in ethnology and folklore. People have done dissertations on the lullaby, on women's prenuptial rituals. Sheila is here tonight, and her thesis has just won a large folklore prize. When she came home from Australia yesterday, she discovered she had won this wonderful prize, the Michaelis Jena Ratcliffe Prize for Folklore. So congratulations, Sheila. So we do these interviews, and I would encourage all of you who are not MLit students, a few of you are, but those of you who aren't, please sign up and do an MLit with us. Our oldest graduate was 83 years old, and our youngest graduate 23, so there's plenty of room for all of you in our department. Our research has all sorts of different outputs, performances and workshops, books, articles in journals, and other means of communicating with the public. We have our field school in ethnology and folklore, where we take our students on a magical mystery tour across Scotland in all sorts of weathers. As you can see, it's always sunny for the field school. The students do field work. This is a very cold evening in the Borders, watching the Borders ball games as the frost and snow began to come down, and some of these students had not brought the proper gear for living in Scotland. But we soon send them to the charity shops to acquire thick woolen underwear. Which reminds me, this is not really relevant, but when James Madison Carpenter, the American collector, folklore collector, song collector, in the 1930s, worked his way up the east coast of England and then into Scotland, and he said, by the time I got to Aberdeen, I was cold. So I went into the store, I went into the shop, and I said, give me the warmest, thickest woolen long underwear you have. And I practically lived in that underwear for 6 years. He slept in his open-topped car, by the way, for 6 years in Scotland. Yikes. Classwork, of course. We have a mixture of fieldwork and classwork, all sorts of different means of teaching through making radio programs, a small film project, things like that, alongside all the fieldwork stuff. Our research and publications, my colleague Frances Wilkins' book over there, Singing the Gospel Along Scotland's Northeast Coast, her book recently out, very interesting volume. So we have a number of themes that we draw on or that we touch upon in our work. One of them is renewal, that is passing along of traditions. How do people pass along traditions? How do traditions turn into new traditions and perpetuate themselves as something else? The urge to create, the urge to communicate runs through all kinds of traditions, and even though the form of those traditions change, the process of learning and the process of traditions developing and changing remains the same. So on the left side there's an older man up in Peterhead teaching a younger girl how to build little boaties. They build these model boats from this long to about this long and race them on the local loch. So we ran a workshop for a number of years apprenticing young people to these older makers. And we thought, everybody thought really, nobody's going to be interested in this. But we had 10 or 12 places and we had 120 applicants from most of them young people ranging from 16 to 26 or something like that. So there's an interest to learn from people. There's an interest for people to take part in community events and take part in community traditions. And the skills that girl learned in that workshop will be transferable to other things. Even the process of learning itself is transferable to other events, other projects. We're interested in inclusion as well, and this is an event we held last May during the May Festival, where we brought an old-fashioned travelers' camp on the left side and a modern travelers' caravan on the right side, and we held a number of events there, some craft workshops, talks about traveler life today, and how when you see a traveler camp by the roadside, you might think they've just rolled up there. But in fact, because the caravans can fool us, the medium of traveler life is now the caravan rather than the tent. But in fact, those families have been coming there for 300, 400, 500 years in many cases, and go even further back than that in Scottish history. So just to be fooled by the surface of how a culture presents itself is something we try to work through with our students and learn, through talking to people, what you can learn about cultures that you don't know just by looking at the surface there. Tradition, of course, evolves. It doesn't stay static, and traditions change from Neepy lanterns to pumpkins, you all will have seen, and to plastic daggers through the head as well. So we don't take tradition as fixed in time, but rather as evolving over time, and we try to get behind that process and behind what's driving people forward in wanting to learn things and do things and make things. Boat building is quite an interesting metaphor for us. These are some pictures from Port Soy. We have a current PhD student, Lorna Summers, who's out there somewhere. There she is, working on local boat building traditions and how they're being repurposed for community purposes on the north coast there in Port Soy. And that develops when people have a sense of community and a sense of relying on others, in cross-generational friendships and interests, then you build social resilience. You build the capacity for people to work through the world with a sense of confidence and cultural self-esteem that I think is a very interesting feature of tradition. When you think of tradition, you think of, here's some old-fashioned songs that have been around for 100 years, 200 years, 500 years. But really, tradition is the process of learning from other people and from creating community out of places where there wasn't community, from passing along knowledge, learning how to cope with the world around you. And so those skills are very useful in any walk of life, in any part of the world. So that brings me to David Buchan. He was the first director of the Elphinston Institute, my predecessor by 4. Unfortunately, he passed away quite young. I think he was 52. Well, you do the math yourself. 55, is it? Something like that. At any rate, he was a leading folklore scholar with an international reputation. That's him outside Elphinston Hall there. And this lecture is designed to show the diversity of work that folklore does and that folklorists do, Each lecture showcases some sort of different aspect of that, but I think connecting them all is that idea of how people make sense of the world and how they deal with what's thrown at them as they go through life. David Buchan published on a range of things. His seminal book on the ballad and oral tradition was his first really well-known work, but he also published on contemporary legends and medical folklore and that sort of thing. And you'll find a collection of his essays out there on the table in the front. So these are still used in our classes today and in classes all over North America and places on the continent as well. So an international scholar of great significance. And so we have dedicated this lecture series to him, where we bring scholars of international repute to talk to us about their thinking on certain aspects of tradition. Tonight, we're going to look at how we memorialize people in these troubled times, and who gets memorialized, who decides, who objects. And our speaker is Professor Regina Bendix, Chair of European Ethnology at the University of Göttingen. Her research interests have focused on cultural tourism, but also on ethnography of the senses, heritage and culture, and the history of cultural fields of research, and indeed the culture of academia itself. She did her undergraduate degree with the redoubtable Alan Dundas, a legendary figure in folklore studies, in Berkeley, and completed a couple of PhDs well before she was 16, as most people on the continent seem to do. So without further ado, I shall introduce Regina Bendix.
Given me the honor to hold this lecture, which is a renowned lecture, and giving me a chance to recognize the work that is being done at this very friendly institute. I'm really, really happy to be here. The kind of material that I will present to you comes from the places I have worked. Examples from the United States and examples from Germany, and perhaps in the discussion or afterwards when we have the food, we can talk further about things here. I'm even just walking around campus, I could of course see that you have a lot of markers in your closest surroundings here, including that coffin where nobody's under it because it didn't fit through the door, etc. So I shall start. Summer 2017 proved a hot summer of memorial and commemorative politics. It contributed in sociocultural and political terms to an effect that Thomas Hylland Erikson has labeled overheating. Erikson articulates three interrelated crises: environment, economy, and identity, which are globally evident but locally experienced and negotiated. Defacing monuments and toppling statues is an indicator of overheated identity politics, evident also in the political fallout that they have created and continue to create. In 2017, this was particularly evident in the United States. August 2017 saw the unfolding of a violent discussion concerning monuments for the Confederate side of the American Civil War. On August 12th, there was in the city of Charlottesville a march of armed neo-nationalists, neo-fascists, Ku Klux Klan members titled Unite the Right, and it found cohesion within an ideology of white supremacy and white maleness and resulted in physical altercations and a terrorist act. A young white man drove in his car into a group of counter-protesters, killing one of them. Now I need to know. Yes. The Charlottesville statue of Confederate General Lee, one of many such statues in former Confederate locations, is but one of many figures that has come to encode a set of ideological positions. In a stormy, Republican-ruled America, it encouraged taking to the streets to protest their suggested removal. The defenders of Confederate statues are fighting for an America that never really was, a white America, an America that would leave behind all the achievements of equal rights, women's rights, attention to diversity, not just in speech, but in practice, an America tired of political correctness and emboldened by a president actively encouraging a politics of difference and hate. Debate about another figure of remembrance, Christopher Columbus, has also gathered steam. There have been protests against October 12th, the date commemorating Columbus's arrival or purported arrival in the Americas, at least since the 1950s. But in the aftermath of the Charlottesville March, the movement gained momentum, and more major US cities have renamed the second Monday in October Indigenous People Day. Public historians and heritage scholars recognize the golden opportunity. The role of monuments and statuary devoted to particular moments and figures in history deserves ongoing critical reflection, and if you watched social media or listservs of scholars in these realms, you could see a great deal of reflection and suggestions and on teaching suggestions going far beyond the Charlottesville monument. For researchers in our realm, I would say memorial markers and memorial practices, this heating up offers opportunity to take stock of different kinds of material markers associated with the broad range of figures and events communities have deemed relevant for special and lasting attention. A growing and continually differentiating national and international heritage and administration, a heritage regime and a heritage administration has sought to absorb ever new facets of the heritage worthy, including difficult and ambivalent events and sites. Indeed, UNESCO, after some hesitation, turned to include also the dark sites of remembrance on its World Heritage List. Places such as Elmina Castle in Ghana as a hub of the slave trade, and the concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau are prime examples, both nominated already in 1979. It is an effort to inscribe globally the remembrance of cruelty, violence, and injustice. However, an inscription cannot control how groups and individuals choose to emotionally and politically respond. The master narrative may not be what individuals on the trail of burgeoning dark tourism seek and feel. Next to those mourning the horrors of concentration camps such as Buchenwald, there are also those who arrive on motorcycles and re-semanticize a site of horror as a site of remembering the glories of fascism. Re-education only goes so far, and the dissonance that led to catastrophe in the first place slumbers under the surface. It is thus not just the statues of General Lee that illustrate how stone and metal monuments can turn into stumbling stones, how the purportedly shared moral fiber of a polity shows itself to be everything but uniform. Rather, societies are continually renegotiating what is worthy of collective remembrance. A time such as the present, characterized by deep division, is also a time to re-examine what of the historically taken for granted ought to be affirmed or put into question. My main focus will not be on big sites, but on a number of small memorial interventions, probing the logics behind these materializations of memory. I will then contrast them with another kind of heritage, the debris of war, that no one sought to foster, but that presents itself with a great deal of agency in everyday life. And I will conclude with what I would term recycled heritage, taken down and repurposed for new interventions to demonstrate that there is also potential for creatively resolving memorial conundrums. I do this on the backdrop of, at this point, common knowledge of global heritage initiatives carried forward by UNESCO since 1972, the Convention for the Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expression. Oh, I seem to have it started 72 with the World Heritage. The latest one is the one for the protection of diversity and of cultural expression. And many special heritage conventions have come in between, such as underwater heritage or world memory. There has been a wealth of critical examination of this phenomenon by scholars in folklore studies, ethnology, history, social anthropology, and cultural geography. There has also been ample recognition of the local, regional, and national protection initiatives for monuments, landscapes, and cultural impressions since the late 19th century. Understanding memory and its production through the works from Maurice Halbachs to Pierre Nora and to Jan and Aleida Assmann and beyond is furthermore firmly ensconced in a great deal of heritage scholarship. So allow me to just take that for granted and to proceed pragmatically looking at specific cases. Minor instances of heritage making illustrate the dynamic inherent to what is generally intended to be lasting eternally. After all, marble, stone, and iron stand for extreme endurance. Yet shades of disinterest or even dissent may accumulate, and what was once a central building block of local or national heritage is forgotten. Conversely, monument building may increase on the part of a majority, leaving a minority stifled and unable to shape a present or future under the weight of heritage, with dissent simmering under the surface. This certainly is evident in the case of statues and memories from the American Civil War, or remnants also of colonial markers in post-colonial states, as well as remnants of communist markers in the terrain of the former USSR. Throughout, I will look at the materiality of monuments, their affect and malleability, or lack thereof. In materializing what was experienced, suffered through, considered tremendous and worthy, humans create statues, plaques, or installations that test future generations. Decoding a past aesthetic may prove a Barthesian semiological challenge, and the successful decoding may give rise to anger or opposition. The three initial examples I collectively term stumbling stones. They are, in the big scheme of heritage and memorial activity, minor. But all of them allow for an exploration of multivocality and dissonance of actual and metaphorical stumbling stones in changing historical contexts. The three examples point to a complement of factors that contribute to and constitute sites of memory and that I would like our site to be trained on. The shape and materiality of the site or monument, the initiators, their motives, and what happens when they pass away and their motives begin to fray, and very important, the funding behind the monument. Laura Jane Smith has, since her influential The Uses of Heritage in 2006, and in a veritable avalanche of publications since then, trained critical heritage researchers gaze on the policy and governance dimension of heritage making. Relying on this focus, which Barbara Kirstenblatt-Gimblett has inaugurated already in 1992, I would like to tease out and give more attention to the interplay of material, money, and motives. These three M's should help one to understand the rise, as well as the dissipation, the controversies, as well as the apathy vis-à-vis heritage-carrying devices. Emotional engagement suffuses heritage endeavors, and while the protests surrounding the removal of General Lee's statue, with which I began, arouses patriotic, nationalistic, or separatist fury, there are also smaller, everyday, or unremarkable emotions sustained by some heritage markers. Looking at the emotional consequences of everyday common sense or even banal aspects of the past, remembered, may offer a balance to the contested memorials and allow for a more comprehensive understanding of the nexus of heritage and value in a socially invariably intensely diverse present. And with that, we come to case one. Yeah, it's a little too early. In 1978, the defunct textile mill of Lowell, Massachusetts, were rendered a National Historic Park. In a city suffering a strong economic downturn precisely because of the closure of the mills, the industrial heritage was restored for visitors. Documentation was produced and a major focus was placed on remembering class and gender of those who had contributed to worker power and welfare, researched poignantly by Martha Norkunas. The female mill workers of the 19th century had sought to educate themselves and engaged in unionizing activities with slogans such as what you see here, industry, not servitude. The heritage construction thus highlighted particularly women. Among the works of public art commissioned, there were also a few black and golden bricks set into the sidewalk near the site of the boarding houses where working women lived. They bore the names and dates of women and some men who worked in the boot cotton mills. In July 2017, when I walked through the site, these bricks were gone, replaced with plain bricks, and a small monument for a woman educator, Lucianne Hill, was overgrown. Seeking to find out what had happened with the named stones from a former curator at this heritage site, I received the following email response, quote, "The bricks with boarding house residents were removed without fanfare some time ago. I did not realize they had been removed. There may have been an issue with maintenance, snow removal, or damage to the special name blocks. I can ask, I will let you know." He never actually did. So here you see that. The commemorative materials used are small and quote-unquote normal. Bricks that one uses for building houses and factories and for paving paths. The size and shape were chosen in symbolic alignment with those to be remembered. Plain workers, many of them female, who contributed to the success of the mills in the 19th and early 20th century, until the cheaper textile mills of the global south grew too strong. The actors involved in the genesis of the Lowell Industrial Park in the 70s were strong proponents for honoring labor history, and the feminist component in the choice of public artworks, including these stones, is unmistakable. The park was funded by federal monies. It belongs to the US National Park System, with additional resources raised locally and regionally. What has changed since the initial creation of the park in the 1970s that would make the disappearance of these small yet significant monuments possible without public discussion, indeed without the knowledge even of someone working within the park himself. When the park was designed, the last generation of mill workers, in particular women, was still alive. They offered a great deal of oral testimony. A documentary film was made with them. They occasionally served themselves as interpreters on the site and were thus themselves significant stakeholders in the maintenance of such small, but to them significant named stones in the pavement. As of the 1990s, their numbers grew smaller and smaller. Today, none are living, and their descendants may themselves not even have noticed the disappearance of the stones, as their emotional investment is likely more tied to a gravestone of their parent than to a more collective heritage intervention. We are also beyond the peak of shaping industrial heritage sites, a wave on which the Lowell Historical Park rode in the 1970s. Attention has turned to other types of heritage. The National Park Service, furthermore, has faced cuts in the newest administration, and the kinds of public artworks supported in the initial transformation of decaying mills into a site of remembrance rich in social and occupational history are not at the forefront of investors' minds. Let me turn now to case 2. Honoring and remembering people important to a society in the form of markers set into sidewalks is, of course, very familiar from Hollywood. Here, individuals deemed worthy are honored in the form of brass or terrazzo stars set smoothly into the Walk of Fame. As of 2018, there were more than 2,600 stars placed there, funded by the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. During a Sunday afternoon visit, also in 2017, the stars appeared for the most part heavily trod on, Some visitors, including myself, were searching for known names. You can sort of guess who I was looking for here. But given the many pedestrians, one could not help also walking on the smooth surface of the stars. Many appeared stained and dirtied with ice cream and other food droppings or of less or more permanent nature. Coral and dark coal in color and set in cement, the stars are honoring and remembering the workforce of the movie and music industry, much like the bricks did in Lowell. The idea rose in 1953 within the Hollywood Improvement Association. The inspiration may have come from stars set in the ceiling of the Hollywood Hotel's dining room, and an initial list of honorees was drawn up. The motivation was heavily commercial, and at first met with opposition from many of the property owners along the streets where the stars were to be embedded, as they were to pay for the new streetlights and sidewalks where such stars could be embedded. They lost their lawsuit, but a second lawsuit delayed matters further, filed by Charlie Chaplin Jr., who sought damages on behalf of his father, who was excluded from the initial list of honorees due to another lawsuit from which Chaplin Sr. had been exonerated, and much more likely due to Chaplin's left-wing politics. The Chaplins lost that suit, but Charlie got his star eventually in 1972, and the first stars were installed in 1960-61. While the stars thus were smoothly placed into the ground, the economic and ideological stumbling was part of the founding of this ground-level monument. Intended to improve business along Hollywood Boulevard, there was rather a period of architectural and business decay to be witnessed throughout the 1970s along there. These pictures kind of remember. It looks very different now, but that was what it's like in the 1970s. Nonetheless, the Los Angeles Cultural Heritage Commission protected the stars when the subway construction forced their temporary removal and prevented the building authorities to jackhammer them out of the ground. In 2008, the stars were evaluated, as many of them do not weather the test of time at all that well, not surprisingly, given that they are being walked over all the time, and a good number of them got restored. A changing guard of local luminaries serve in selecting, administering the monument, geared toward continuous expansion. And I'm not showing the star of a certain president that during the last couple months has repeatedly been jackhammered by people who are trying to remove it. Within the larger landscape of the film industry in Los Angeles, the Walk of Fame bears testimony to the competitive climate between various studios, and each of those studios have memorial activity also going on inside their walls, and who each offer also tourist tours. So the competition between them and Hollywood businesses who all try to profit from the diversifying industry and the celebrities. Case 2 is thus an example of continuous heritage construction with mild components of honoring great representative and strong enlisting of those very same representatives in fostering the ongoing viability of both the huge city and the complex industry. The dissonances regarding who is to be honored are few and far between, but they also do occur. Stepping on the representation of those honored has struck me as a strange bodily practice in Los Angeles, but even more so in my third example, which is not from occupational culture. The third case. Germany has such a thick landscape of remembrance, in particular Holocaust remembrance, asserting Germany's guilt and ensuing sorrow, that one could easily undertake an encyclopedic endeavor with them and embark on a critical study of the changing nature of the materialization of Holocaust guilt. I will limit myself to the artistic intervention from which I borrowed the title for this talk, the Stumbling Stones, or Stolpersteine. They were initiated in the early 1990s by the German artist Gunter Demnig. Born in 1947, Demnig devoted a number of projects to efforts at remembrance. His most famous are, however, the Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones. To remind passers-by of individuals and families who were driven out of their homes during National Socialism, These stones are set at the entrance of the respective houses everywhere from Germany's largest cities to villages, and in the meantime also in 21 further European cities. In the size and make of cobblestones, they have a handmade metal surface on which the names of those to be remembered are engraved. The stones are then set into the sidewalk ceremoniously using proper masonry tools, handmade, obviously. Unlike the stars or the brick in the first two examples, cobblestones are not flat or even, so they're not smooth in nature, and these particular stones seek to use the very uneven nature of the stone, familiar from any cobblestone street still found around the world, to transport a mental stumbling occasioned through the potential bodily stumbling of a careless passerby. Here, the cover of a walking guide to the one on the left, walking guide to Stolpersteine or Stumbling Stone in Berlin, and a separate picture of two such memorials in Berlin at Frankfurter Allee in Berlin. Berlin is very, I mean, if you have been to Berlin, you have seen Stolpersteine, but you also see them in villages. The existence of such a tour guide points to the huge success that Demnik's intervention has been graced with. They are the biggest decentralized monument worldwide. As of the end of 2017, more than 61,000 stones were placed, and just a month ago, that number had risen by another 9,000, as this news clipping shows here. The project has been honored with several prizes and has thus long ceased to be an intervention, but rather has risen to a type of monument many groups would like to support. There are school classes, civic groups, as well as city councils that endeavor to research possible sites for stumbling stones and then commission Gunter Demnik to make and install them once descendants have agreed to the process. You have to find descendants, if possible, of the Jewish individuals who were deported in order to sanction the process. But it is interesting because the first ones of these Demnik placed at night near the dome in Cologne as a proper stealth kind of intervention, and at this point they are almost bureaucratic measure. The cost per stone is an affordable 120 euros, and the bureaucratic effort really relatively minor, and yet there is also dissonance, such as most recently in Munich, where in 2018 the decision was made to discontinue them. I followed the debate concerning Stolpersteine in Göttingen, where I live and work. Göttingen has seen the refounding of Jewish communities since 1995. And there is also a Jewish-Christian alliance, and in the early 2000s, a more conservative group, the Jüdische Kultusgemeinde, also took shape. An abandoned synagogue from a village about 30 kilometers away was moved to Göttingen and refurbished, and a kosher restaurant opened a few years ago. The city of Göttingen had erected its own Holocaust memorial, which you see right here on the site of where the synagogue used to be. And Göttingen has been trying to participate in the Stumbling Stone movement for years. The element of commemorative competition cannot be denied here, as far smaller cities in the region had already successfully emplaced stumbling stones. The city council had asked the Jewish groups how they would feel about it, and given the mixed response, abstained. The leadership of the Kultusgemeinde voiced its opposition repeatedly. When they were asked again in 2013, they offered a powerful statement in an open letter preserved on their website. In a mixture of amazement and sorrow, Eva Tichauer-Moritz, as chairperson of the group, pointed to the thicket of memorial activity in Germany, activity she felt that failed to address the needs of the present and future. The conclusion of the statement you can see here in German, and I will translate. As a Jew of the second generation, I can only ask, do you want to live with the Jews in the future? Why are you not taking care of the living and let the dead rest? You can do your remembering on November 9th. We survivors of the second and third generations, we remember almost every day, and we have our Yom HaShoah, the day of the Shoah on which we go to the memorial by ourselves. But it would be good if you were to care for all Jews in Göttingen and in the district, and not just for those whom you select yourselves, because it is more comfortable and because it wonderfully calms your conscience. We have done everything, this quote there. After all, we have to and want to live with you and accept you with all your rough edges. It's a pretty strong hammer. Alas, this opposition was overcome, not least to successful efforts of the City Museum in Göttingen to restitute some of its artifacts to descendants of Jewish families driven out of the town in 1930. This encouraged further memorial activity, and in March 2015, Göttingen finally emplaced its first own stumbling stones. In a city like Göttingen, Tichauer Moritz's voicing of opposition is particularly poignant, and one can enlarge it further and expand it to all three examples I have used here, with the consideration of the intertwining of materiality, body, and mind. Göttingen regards itself as a city of knowledge makers. There are many plaques on facades memorializing famous scholars who lived there or spent some time there. From Gauss to Goethe, there are signs to be seen. I picked out some lesser-known individuals here. So signs to be seen for individuals, many of whom are actually forgotten by the majority of citizens living in the respective houses. To see the signs, one has to look up, and the tourist bureau offers tours during which this body posture is practiced. Look up, be impressed, and feel small in the face of what this or that individual contributed to scholarship, to literature, and to music. The stumbling stones, by contrast, are designed with the assumption that we literally stumble, that our body, inattentive to its feet, is shaken a bit through by a stumble, and the stumble in turn is meant to let us lower our gaze, and then in that bent body posture and reading the names, remember the crimes committed by fascism. Humbled in their proud, upright gait, Germans are to remember the everyday atrocities that happened right there in their own hometown. Without a doubt, the sensory bodily dimension is an important component in designing markers and monuments. Materials, size and shapes, location and light, all are meant to communicate an aesthetic shock. If you look at this monument here, this gargantuan statue of Chairman Mao, 36 meters high in Changsha, Yunnan province, and finished in 2009, I think you see a great exemplification of the aim for affect and effect, awe and submission. We know little about how viewers actually experience them, but for looking, we would have to look at open or clandestine practices and material traces, the wreath or bouquet placed at the feet of a statue, or conversely the spray paint applied to a colossal representation of the ruler or the deceased ruler, intended to offend and oppose the moral alignment demanded. Stumbling stones represent an everyday approach, typical of a democratic society, where there is sufficient freedom to intervene in the public sphere after public negotiation on an interweaving of remembrance and memorial activity adapted to quite different goals. We'll set this aside now, and I will now turn to a very different type of figurative as well as actual stumbling stone. Unwanted heritage, dissonant heritage that is present and exercises its potentially devastating power across the globe in many places. I'm speaking of the detritus of war. Late modern warfare has left many regions of the world littered with landmines. The respective wars may be overcome, more or less successful, new governments may be installed, but a farmer working his fields, a family migrating from one place to another, or even just a herd of cattle may chance inadvertently on unexploded mines, get hurt, mutilated, or killed. Material, motive, and money, our 3 M's, first interacted to culminate in warfare in the past, but they continue to bring forth calamity at worst or, in better scenarios, demand great effort and resources to be removed. Indeed, the effort to remove this inheritance of dissonance can cost considerably more than building some kind of desired heritage adumbrated with specific educational goals. I moved to Germany in 2001, and during those 17 years, I have heard countless reports about huge World War II bombs having been found on construction sites. A new shopping mall, a parking garage, or a subway line was commissioned, but some days into digging, suspicious material came to the fore. They can bring back difficult, painful pasts with vehemence and enormous impact on everyday life. On the first weekend of September 2017, 70,000 inhabitants of Frankfurt, Germany, had to evacuate their homes due to a stumbling stone of such devastating dimensions, an unexploded World War serial bomb. That was the biggest one ever in Germany's history, this particular evacuation, not the bomb. It held 1.5 tons of explosive material. It was the biggest evacuation in Germany's history, as I just said. There are few individuals skilled in disarming a bomb built 70 years ago. The professionals involved in rendering such weapons harmless require skills that, depending on the age of the weapons, are rare. And if you want to get sarcastic, such skills actually ought to perhaps be nominated as intangible cultural heritage, because practitioners are few and far between, and usually there is traffic stop for 2 to 3 days or train line stop until these individuals have been brought to that site. This is all the more frightening as such fines and ensuing mass evacuations continue to be part of everyday life several times a year. Frankfurt had one already in that same year, 2017. Koblenz had one on the same weekend, and as I was finalizing the talk here for last weekend, Hanau had to evacuate 6,000 people in a radius of 1 kilometer around such a bomb find, and Limburg had disarmed one just the evening before, last Friday. Next to the carefully reasoned and generally well-funded public memorials to victims of the Holocaust, and next to the private and public educational efforts to come to terms with the guilt of the past in Germany, the unexpected finds of these monsters bring the past into the present with a physical immediacy that carefully reasoned memorials should not strive for. There is the discomfort of having to evacuate. In this case, hospitals, in that Frankfurt case, hospitals and old age homes were also affected. And for a brief moment, this society, that especially since the summer of 2015, struggles with the steady arrival of refugees from elsewhere, generated photos that show the country's own population seeking real rather than mental refuge from its past. Then there is the shock that one had been living for decades in the vicinity or on top of a weapon that could have gone off unexpectedly, and indeed that may have companions nearby, not as yet discovered. The cruelty and danger is perhaps less immediate than the small deadly landmines that go off regularly in places like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and parts of Africa. But affected groups will carry away from such an evacuation a psychosomatic residue of the specter of war. One might invoke phenomenologist Hermann Schmitz's notion of atmosphere as a spatial, sensorial perception lodged and processed in the body. In the case of an atmosphere, in this case, an atmosphere characterized by deep uncertainty and anxiety. Referring back to Nadia Seremetakis' early evocation of the memory of the senses, people evacuating from their neighborhood fear and thus feel the threat of the nearly exploded 75-year-old bombs. These interruptions from daily life are not planned. They will never be routine, and they lodge in the body and mingle with narratives and images of World War II and the horror with which it ended. In the brute danger to body and possessions, this complements the aesthetic interventions, monuments, and exhibitions more generally considered heritage. Disarming a bomb is no stumbling matter. As I said, it requires skilled human agency, and if successful, prevents death and destruction. Whereas the bomb itself carries within it, over decades, the motive to annihilation. In Göttingen, the effort to undo such a bomb in 2010 failed, and 3 expert disarmers died. It is wholesome to contrast these inheritances with our feeble efforts to keep the past in the present. The chances for such a bomb to be misread are nil. With their makers long dead and the war they were made for long finished, the agency rests in the bomb's own materiality. There is no second guessing what it can do. By contrast, the chances for monuments in stone or metal to be misread, starting with the moment of their installation, are ever present. And misinterpretations of history, simmering opposition bursting out into outright aggression, are part and parcel of individual and group dynamics. On March 1st, 2010, the Jerusalem Post reported that the first stumbling stones emplaced in Rome, Italy, had been vandalized. One of the reasons why also Munich has decided not to have them in the ground anymore, but find something higher up. Or returning to the events in Charlottesville with which I began, a statue and its threatened removal can generate violence and death in the name of ideological positions that clearly have not been overcome. Let me now turn to a last example that is, in its pragmatism and irony, strikes me as a great signal for how to accept the passing significance of memorials and the heritage they seek to communicate. Again, I invite you to Göttingen, a city where battles surrounding monuments for war heroes, for cartoon figures, and for or against kings have been raging for as long as I have lived there, faithfully documented in our daily paper and commented on by countless readers' letters. Statues of this figure, however, have found favor. Georg Christoph Lichtenberg was a scholar of great intellectual breadth and fervor. He worked in physics and developed some new instruments. He wrote aphorisms. He initiated a journal that also included social commentary. And given his short stature and his hunchback, he was a well-known figure in the town in the 18th century when he lived. In 1992, a Göttingen publisher, T.T. Böttger, commissioned Albanian artist Fuat Dushku in Tirana to produce this bronze sculpture along with a second standing-up representation of Lichtenberg. The beauty of it is not just its unimposing nature, showing the little man integrated in student and urban life. The nature of its materiality is what is significant. The sculpture used defunct Albanian sculptures to create these new works. Böttger himself, a colorful, now 78-year-old individual, who has been involved in diplomatic endeavors and art sponsorship in many sites around the globe, clearly found pleasure in the material used for the work. Lichtenberg is a recycled dictator, he stated, Enver Hoxha with a bit of Stalin. Recycled statuary is, of course, not novel. One can find, for instance, in Ankara, Turkey, early modern buildings making use of ancient stones and ancient statues that are sort of used like stones sitting in their square or horizontally. They were used in building walls for what was then the present and no longer of interest as aesthetic markers. The recycling approach disempowers prior heritage sentiment, and one might well suspect that adherents of communism will be none too pleased to see Marx or Lenin melted and cast into molds for a changed present. But the Albanian example nonetheless offers a fresh breath of air. Things oppressive do not need to last. They can be transformed into something else, and this liberating element might well be added to an often stifling approach to safeguarding and protecting. In concluding, I would put forward that the twofold approach that I presented might also offer some guideposts through the thicket of extant memorials and their attendant heritage policies. Considering materiality, motive, and money on the one hand, On the other hand, heritage cycles, where we see motive heat up or cool down and money evaporate, is conducive to disentangling some of the more thorny problems arising in the politics of contested heritage. Small interventions, such as the various stumbling stones discussed, offer a good insight into the emotional investment on the part of involved protagonists. The ethical dimensions of heritage policy and practice are ultimately best considered from a foundation based on the actual emotional attention of those for whom heritage work is being done. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Regina. Any comments or questions? Anybody would like to bring something up or talk about their own local memorial for something?
Yeah.
Yes, Nick.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. There must be a way to...
Yeah, if you push speak, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like in
Is
the
that
UN.
on? Oh,
yes, it is.
Lovely. Yes, thank you for that wonderful talk. Very fascinating. I was wondering if you could perhaps tie in some of these larger memorials, or memorials that have maybe a wider public attention or public support or lack of support, as you've mentioned, and connect them to some of the smaller sort of everyday memorials that exist. Like when we were walking out earlier and we saw that bench just across of the deputy sacrist, and it has a photo of his two grandchildren, sort of that sort of smaller memorial that maybe normal everyday people might put up and try to catch the attention of the passerby, for example.
I mean, the small memorials that people do without asking for permission are particularly interesting in terms of, does one let them do it? You know, there are these instantaneous shrines, for instance, when an important figure has died, or with the various terrorist acts we have had, where people just bring things and teddy bears and what have you. And for a while we permitted. The one that you showed me is a really lovely one. There are other, I know one in Göttingen where a woman living on the street was raped and murdered, and people to this date, and it's now about 12 years since that happened, will bring flowers there, and nobody, I mean, the house behind it has been renovated, etc., but it's still being done. And I'm finding those things particularly meaningful because there has to be a social network around there to explain to others who don't know and to tolerate that public space is being used for this kind of memorial activity. Whereas the ones that I presented all involved some kind of body of people deciding this is what we're going to do. And hopefully, you know, decision make with raising of the hand, hopefully. And there, because then there are also funds flowing into it, they take on a greater measure of responsibility in decision making. The one out there that you showed me is the free will of that family. And they buy the flowers and change the pictures, etc. Whereas with the stumbling stones, as I tried to show, there is ever more investment and debate over their place within a city, the village, or the entire society. And I'm not German, and I've lived there now for 17 years, and I have to confess that I'm finding the German memorial activities oppressive. They are so overwhelmingly present. They're all practically part of the Constitution, and ever new ones are being thought up. And so at the same time, that need to profess guilt also generates the populism against it. The dynamic of people who don't wish to be reminded that they are part of that society. I mean, it's not properly answering your question. I just think the the personal responsibility, which is also part of a grave marker, etc., is differently integrated and lasts with the people who have closeness to that individual, and these things that are standing for a polity need to be decided, negotiated, and correspondingly can lead to strife, such as we've seen in the States with these civil war things. Yeah.
Yes, in the back.
Push a button.
Speak, I think it is.
Oh, okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very rich lecture with lots of different connections across different countries and cultures. I'm particularly interested in the German and Austrian context, and I was wondering if I could ask you perhaps to look into the future, if you can, with regard to now the generation of those who lived through the war and the Holocaust now sadly vanishing, and that memory becoming more and more mediated. How do you envisage this memorial culture developing, say, in the next 20, 30 years?
It's difficult to say. You have, I wouldn't say it's an industry, but you have a lot of sites. You have concentration camp sites, work camp sites, and you have the memorial sites, and expanding, I would say. In Berlin has just added also one for Sinti Roma, Second World War killings. And it really depends on what is happening with the current populist party in all those countries. In Poland too, the will to maintain this is very strongly carried by school curricula as well, and also by people trained in our field, because these are also sites of employment. Being an interpreter in some of these sites. But I've had opportunity to watch the parallel, the memorial culture of the Shoah in Israel, where Jackie Feldman has written a fascinating book on how Israelis deal with Holocaust remembrance, because there too, there are no more living survivors, just as in Germany you have few people who were alive during the fascist regime. And so Israelis take children or young adults or teens to Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's part of the becoming an Israeli. And there's a lot of public debate because Israel is also a very strongly divided society. It's a very strong left, even though it's not that way in the parliament. And the question of why do we have to keep raising children that remember as the most important facet of the founding of the State of Israel, the Holocaust? That linkage is for some people no longer an appropriate linkage, but the concentration camp tourism fosters it to a certain extent. And that same Jackie Feldman did an interesting project with a German colleague where they took German students and Israeli students and made a class together about remembrance sites. And they did a lot of journaling and exchanging their journals about the experience of visiting each other's countries and the respective memorial sites. And there was this one Israeli kid who wrote in his journal how she could no longer tolerate that Germans celebrated their guilt and expected Jews to honor them for celebrating their guilt. So you see this sort of the nestedness of wanting to show in the face of those descendants that these descendants honor this. The question is, what else are you going to put in its place? In the United Kingdom, you have a strong, we just had 100 years since the end of World War I. And as a non-UK person, I always have the sense that that is one of the few celebratory or memorial activities from the United Kingdom that gets internationally reported. You get a lot about the royals, and you get the red poppies, you know, that sort of is carried here. And in part, it's also my own sense of aging, where I wonder about the question that you're raising of not having been able to imagine 20 years ago that we would have politics like we have them today, where that whole certainty of we have the worst wars behind us would be shaken by, because at the moment I really think we are in a very difficult political state. So projecting what people will find worthy of remembrance, you know, you would hope that people would find worthy of remembrance the founding of the European Union, but I'm in this country right now, where that whole, you know, so I'm watching, for instance, the rise of this movement called Pulse of Europe, which in many European cities holds events and protests trying to build that. And you have the European Union itself fostering heritage events like the Cultural Capital of Europe, trying to create something that would celebrate the emergence of a new kind of polity. But in the face of the nationalism that we are having the last 10, 15 years, I'm sort of fearing we're going back to, you know, the Middle Ages in terms of what we're going to celebrate and honor, rather than trying to take the frail bits that we've accomplished. So.
Another one. One more. Oh, yep.
I had a question about if you had a view or an interest in the way we respond to memorials. I'm struck in this country we almost have a fetish about our memorials. You know, they aren't touched, they're precious and sacred, and if they are touched or defaced, it's often national news. The right-wing press get outraged very easily about those things. When you go to Southern Europe in particular, people have been writing on the memorials for hundreds of years. I mean, they become memorials to people that inscribed their names 300 years ago with their girlfriend, which is new. And when you, as someone who comes from a culture where we just don't do that because it's just seen as not acceptable, I found that quite shocking to begin with. But of course, in a sense, they've turned those memorials into memorials for the 1,000 people who have written their names on them since the 17th century. I wonder if you think there's a difference in the way that cultures respond to the culture of memorialization.
Well, I mean, certainly there is a difference in how people respond to it. On the other hand, on my tour today, through various things, I saw these church pews where people also had scratched their names in it. So there is perhaps not everywhere such, or you have to put protections around certain memorials so people don't go close. I think that's something that you find in many places, but it has to do with the tolerance for it. I think what you're raising, that here you suspect it wouldn't be tolerated if people would deface something. It would be considered desecration, defacing, and hence not occur, where elsewhere you could interpret it positively, that people embrace it and you know, want to be part of it and smear their name on it. I mean, that would go into that kind of realm of emotional attention to memorials. And that is actually something I mentioned in here is very poorly researched. How people integrate memorials in their daily practice, whether in walking past it, they're aware of it being there. I think that's, and whether it is a site or a statue or something that has sort of unanimous approval, or whether it is something problematic. Again, in Göttingen there was a monument for the unknown soldier from World War I, a relatively small one, that got decapitated in the 1930s. They fixed it. There are photos of them fixing it. Then they moved it to another location in the site where it was. Then the whole thing got knocked off from it, and so they gave it as a gift to a village about 50 kilometers away, figuring those people would not do to it as had been done by a city of a lot of students, which is what Göttingen is. It is also a matter of the composition of the town. So, but sure, there are differences in emotional response and toleration and money to fix it again. You also have to have money to clean up memorials. And I don't know whether you read the news reporting just in the last couple days of, I don't remember whether, I think it was Bulgaria or was it Ukraine, where they were painting Russian monuments, or they were overpainting them so that these fleeting soldiers suddenly wore Superman costumes and the clown. So I thought those were great uppity kinds of ways of responding to memorial figures that one didn't want to have anymore.
Right, well, I think we'll wind up. I'll invite you all to join us for salmon, oatcakes, and cheese out in the foyer there. A couple of announcements. Don't forget to look at your Elphinston Institute newsletters and public event leaflets for our film series and public lectures in January. And I'll just finish off by saying thank you all very much for coming, and thank you very much to Professor Bendix for joining us this evening and speaking so eloquently. Thank you.